Okay, so you wanted to do a deep dive on Darryl Cooper, the historian,
Mhm.
who got in a lot of trouble with his comments about World War II.
Yeah,
And we thought it'd be interesting to kind of look at this interview that he did on the Joe Rogan Experience as like a primary source
right.
and kind of dive into how this guy, um, thinks.
Yeah, this is a really interesting interview because we're not just exploring historical content, but we're also exploring Cooper's way of thinking about history itself
Yeah.
and particularly sensitive topics.
Yeah, and he doesn't shy away from it. Right
Right.
off the bat, he talks about, how we should approach historical figures with humility,
Yeah.
even those who, we might now look at as monsters.
Right.
And one of the figures that he brings up is Saddam Hussein's son, Uday Hussein, who was, by all accounts, a brutal dictator. But he points out that Uday was forced to witness torture and executions at
Yeah.
a very young age. And it just kind of makes you think like, wow,
Yeah.
how much did that environment contribute to who he became?
Right. It's really hard to separate nature and nurture,
Yeah.
especially when we're talking about somebody who was brought up in such a, how would you say, like a deranged household.
Yeah, deranged. Yeah.
He witnessed so many horrific things as a child. It's hard to imagine that that wouldn't have an effect on his psyche as an adult.
Right. It really challenges our sort of, knee-jerk reaction to kind of judge people in the past without really taking into account,
Right.
their upbringing.
Their context.
Yeah, their context. Yeah, exactly.
He says, we can look back at these figures from history and say, oh, well, they were just evil or they were just bad. But we have to remember that they were products of their time and their environment, just like we are.
Yeah. And I think that's something that, it's very easy to fall into that trap of thinking, oh, well, we're so much more enlightened now than people were back then.
Right. We would never do that.
We would never do the things that they did. But I think that that's a very dangerous way of thinking about history.
Yeah, I agree. I think it can lead to a kind of moral superiority complex
Right.
where we assume that we're somehow immune to the forces that shape the past.
Yeah, and it also makes it really difficult to actually learn from history.
Right.
Because if we just dismiss people in the past as evil monsters, then we're not really trying to understand why they did what they did.
And how those same forces might be at play today
Right.
in different ways.
Exactly. And so Cooper really, argues against, I guess, this oversimplification
Yeah.
of history.
Right. He talks about how reducing complex events like World War II to simple good versus evil narratives can actually be really dangerous
Yeah.
because it prevents us from really understanding the nuances of the past
Right.
and the factors that led to these horrific events.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about it, like every, country or every, group of people who engage in warfare, they always believe they're on the right side of history.
Exactly.
They have to.
Yeah, they have to.
In order to justify the violence
Right.
to themselves and to others. Right. And so it's, understanding the context in which those decisions were made, I think is really crucial.
Absolutely.
And that's where I think his emphasis on primary sources comes in. He's a big advocate
Yeah.
for, going back to the original documents, the original accounts of events.
Right. He argues that all historical accounts are biased to some extent,
Right.
especially those written by the victors
Yeah.
or those in power.
And I love the way he draws a parallel between, the news
Oh, yeah.
and history. And, he says that, if we only got our news from a handful of sources,
Yeah. Or only interviewed people who fit a certain profile,
Yeah.
we would have a very skewed view of reality.
Right. And it's just like, if you see somebody doing like a man on the street interview, it's like,
Right.
well, you're just getting, 5 people's opinions.
A very narrow slice.
A very narrow slice of a much larger.
A much larger picture.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like how much of history is missing, because we don't have access to those everyday people's stories.
Especially from marginalized groups.
Yeah.
People who were historically silenced or excluded from the historical record.
Right. And so despite those limitations, Cooper, he still sees the power of storytelling
Yeah.
and, sees himself primarily as a storyteller.
Right. He says that history is ultimately about people
Yeah.
and their stories,
Yeah.
and that it's through these stories that we can connect with the past and make it relevant to our lives today.
Yeah. And he talks about how, he gets emails from people all the time
Yeah.
who say, I never thought I would be interested in history,
Right.
but I listened to your podcast and now I'm hooked.
Yeah. It's amazing how a good story can really spark people's curiosity.
Yeah.
And make them want to learn more.
And it's funny because, he's not afraid to dive into some pretty intense,
Oh, yeah.
areas.
Goes to some dark places.
Oh, yeah. He goes to some really dark places. And one of the examples he gives is, he spent months immersed in, recordings from the Jonestown cult.
Oh, wow.
And
That's heavy stuff.
yeah, and he said that, like, he found himself developing a sense of sympathy for them,
Really?
which is, kind of
That's surprising.
a surprising reaction, I think, to most people, you know?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about Jonestown, we usually think about the tragedy,
Right.
the mass suicide.
Right, the Kool-Aid.
Right, exactly.
But he's asking us to go deeper to try to understand the motivations of the people who were drawn to this community.
Right, to see them as human beings,
Yeah.
not just monsters.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important point because it's easy to judge people from the past based on our own modern values.
Right.
But we have to remember that they were living in a different time with different beliefs and different challenges.
Yeah, and so Cooper's asking us to try to see the world through their eyes.
Yeah.
To understand their context, to understand their motivations.
And to have empathy for their struggles.
Right, and it's not about condoning their actions. It's
Uh-huh.
about trying to understand them.
And I think that's where the real learning comes in.
Yeah, because if we can understand why people do the things they do, even the things that we find horrific,
Right.
then we can start to address the root causes of those problems
Exactly.
and hopefully prevent them from happening again.
It's about breaking the cycle of violence and hatred
Right.
and building a more just and compassionate world.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really powerful message that
Big
Cooper's
chamber.
trying to convey.
Yeah, I think his work is really important because he's challenging us to think critically about history
Yeah.
and about our own place in the world.
Yeah,
He's asking us to be more than just passive consumers of information,
right.
to be active participants in shaping the future.
Right, and I think that that's something that we can all aspire to.
Absolutely. And Cooper also delves into this, this really fascinating aspect of American history, which is the evolution of American identity.
Yeah.
Particularly, the context of immigration.
Well, and he even, brings up how America's kind of always struggled.
Oh, yeah.
This question of who are we?
Right from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Like, who are we as a nation?
Yeah, and he kind of traces it back to, like, the earliest days of the Republic when you had this influx
Yeah.
of Irish and German immigrants
Yeah.
who, really kind of shook things up.
Right. They challenged the existing social order.
Yeah, because back then, like, the idea of being American was pretty much
Yeah.
synonymous with being of English descent.
Right.
So you have this wave of, Irish and German immigrants coming in, and it's like, okay, well, what does it mean to
Right.
be white?
Right.
What does it mean to be American?
It really forced a reassessment of those categories.
Yeah, and I think it's really fascinating how he interprets that first naturalization law from 1790, which was the
1790.
yeah, the one that said that,
They granted citizenship to all free white persons of good moral character.
right.
Yeah.
And like, on the surface, you look at that and you're like, okay, well, that just confirms
Right.
America's intention of being like a white nation.
It seems like a very exclusionary law.
Yeah.
Right.
But he argues that, like, actually that was a radical idea
Oh, yeah, for the time.
for the time.
It was incredibly open.
Yeah, to say that, like, hey, anyone from Europe who's, white and of good moral character
Right.
can come here and become a citizen with, like, full rights.
The full rights, yeah. It was a huge departure from the way things were done in Europe.
Right. And, it's like, can you imagine, like, another country at that time passing a law like that?
No. I mean, it was unheard of at the time.
Yeah.
And he makes the point that America had to be that open in order to survive and expand.
Right, because there weren't enough
There weren't enough English people.
to populate this huge continent.
Yeah, they needed people.
Yeah.
And they needed them fast.
And he also makes the point that, those early waves of immigration,
Yeah.
particularly the Irish,
Right.
were essential to building America. Like,
Who was building the railroads?
yeah, who was building the railroads, working in the factories.
Digging the canals.
Yeah, all that, like, really difficult, dangerous work.
It was the immigrants.
Yeah, and I think that it kind of forced America to develop this much more fluid and adaptable sense of national identity.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas, like, in a lot of European countries, like, your belonging is very much tied to,
Yeah.
your ethnicity, your language, your religion.
Your bloodlines.
Yeah, but in America, it was, like, much more of a,
It was about ideas
yeah.
and ideals.
Yeah, and I think that that's both, like, a strength and a challenge.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it's like on the one hand, it allows America to like constantly reinvent itself.
Yeah, to embrace change.
Yeah, to be this like melting pot. But on the other hand, it also creates a lot of conflict. Yeah, because you have all these different groups competing for resources.
Yeah.
recognition and a sense of belonging.
Right. And I think that's a dynamic that, continues to this day.
Oh, absolutely.
We're still grappling
I'm
with.
still figuring it out.
Yeah, these questions of like, who are we and who belongs here?
And what does it mean to be American?
Yeah.
It's an ongoing conversation.
Right. And he even, draws some parallels between like the experiences of those early European immigrants and the great migration of African Americans out of the South.
Right. Both groups faced tremendous discrimination and prejudice as they tried to build new lives for themselves.
Right. And I think it's a reminder that like this struggle for equality and inclusion is like an ongoing process.
It's woven into the fabric of American history.
Yeah.
It's not something that happened in the past and is now over.
Right. It's still happening.
Still happening today.
Yeah. And it's something that, we need to be aware of and actively working to address.
Absolutely.
And, Cooper, he doesn't just focus on like immigration.
Right.
He also spends a good chunk of time talking about, the rise of industrial capitalism and its impact on society.
And he doesn't sugarcoat it.
No, he doesn't.
He talks about the brutal working conditions, the exploitation of workers, the squalor of urban slums.
Yeah, it's easy to kind of forget that side of history.
Right.
When we're enjoying, our weekends and our paid time off.
Right. We take those things for granted.
Yeah, but like those rights were hard won.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of people had to fight.
And die.
And die.
Had those rights.
Yeah, and he tells the story of the Battle of Blair Mountain.
Oh, wow.
Which is this crazy story where like thousands of coal miners in West Virginia, many of them World War I veterans, literally took up arms against the mining companies and their private army.
It sounds like something out of a movie.
I know, and it took the U.S. Army to put down the uprising.
Wow.
It's a wild story.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that like progress is not always peaceful.
Right. Sometimes it takes violence to achieve justice.
And he doesn't shy away from the darker side of the labor movement either, like the corruption, the mob involvement,
Right.
But he argues that even those aspects need to be understood.
Within the context of the time.
Yeah, it's like they were fighting fire with fire.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were up against these incredibly powerful forces.
Right.
And they had to use whatever means necessary to survive.
Yeah, and it just highlights like how high the stakes were.
Yeah. People were fighting for their lives.
Yeah.
For their families.
And for their future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we can lose sight of.
Yeah.
When we look back at these events from the comfort of our own time.
Right.
We have to remember that these were real people.
Yeah.
With real hopes and dreams and fears.
Yeah. And they were willing to risk everything.
Everything.
To fight for a better world.
And I think that's something that we can all learn from.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating how he brings up this point about how like everything in history is kind of interconnected.
Yeah, he's really big on that idea of like a ripple effect.
Yeah. That
what happens in one part of the world can have these huge unintended consequences.
Yeah, and he uses the example of like the Silk Road. How for centuries it was this like, artery of trade and culture.
Like connecting East and West.
Yeah, exchanging ideas and goods. And, it's like, it's crazy to think about how like, something that was happening like thousands of miles away could have a direct impact on your life.
It's like the butterfly effect.
Yeah.
One small change can lead to these massive shifts.
Right. And he also talks about the role of individuals in shaping history.
Yeah.
And he acknowledges that, like, there are these broad, like, social and economic forces that are at play, but that individuals can still, like, make choices that have a profound impact.
Yeah, he brings up Martin Luther,
right?
Who challenged the Catholic Church,
right,
and sparked the Protestant Reformation,
right? And it's like,
which changed the course of European history.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about how like one person can have such a massive impact.
Yeah, it's inspiring.
Yeah,
it gives you hope that even in the face of like these huge institutions and systems, that individuals can still make a difference.
Right, and that kind of brings us back to Cooper's overarching message, which is that, like, history isn't just about the past.
Right.
It's about understanding, the forces that have shaped our world and using that knowledge to make better decisions in the present.
To create a better future.
Yeah. He wants us to be, like, active participants in shaping the future.
Not just passive observers.
Right, and he's not afraid to, like, challenge us.
Oh, yeah.
To make us uncomfortable.
He pushes buttons.
He pushes buttons to make us think critically about our own beliefs and assumptions.
Yeah. He wants us to question everything.
Yeah, and I think that that's what makes his work so compelling.
Yeah, it's thought-provoking.
Yeah, he makes you realize that, like, learning about history isn't just for, academics or, like, history buffs.
Yeah.
It's for everyone.
It's for anyone who wants to understand the world
Yeah.
and their place in it.
Right. It's about understanding ourselves, our societies, the human condition itself.
Yeah, it's about what it means to be human.
Yeah. And he reminds us that, like, history is never truly finished.
Right.
It's an ongoing process of, like, interpretation and debate and revision.
It's constantly evolving as
Yeah.
new evidence emerges and as our perspectives change.
Yeah. So it's like we always have to be open to, like, new ideas.
Yeah.
And be willing to have our beliefs challenged.
You be challenged, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes, studying history so important.
Absolutely.
It's not just about, like, memorizing dates and names.
Right.
It's about, like, engaging with the past.
Yeah.
Questioning it, debating it.
And using it to inform our understanding of the present.
Right, and ultimately to, like, create a better future.
Yeah, I think that's the goal.
Yeah, and I think that, Cooper's work is a really good example of how to do that.
Yeah, he's a great storyteller.
Yeah.
And he's not afraid to tackle tough subjects.
Right, and I think that that's what we need more of.
Absolutely.
In today's world.
People who are willing to challenge the status quo.
Yeah, and to make us think.
And to make us uncomfortable.
Yeah, and to make us uncomfortable.
Yeah, because that's how we grow.
Right. Well, on that note, I think that's a good place to wrap up our deep dive.
Yeah, I think so too.
Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And to all of our listeners out there, if you're looking for a way to deepen your understanding of the world,
Yeah.
to challenge your assumptions,
To become a more informed and engaged citizen.
I highly recommend checking out Darryl Cooper's work.
Yeah, he's a fascinating guy.
He is, and you might be surprised by what you discover about history and about yourself.
Absolutely.
All right, well, until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
And who knows, maybe you'll discover a new passion along the way.
All right, take care.
See ya.